Hi, and welcome to Ask the Horse Live. I'm your host, Haley Kerstetter, digital editor at thehorse.com. Do you feel like you can no longer afford your horse? Struggling to keep up with the constant expenses? Feeling like only the wealthy can compete? You're not alone. Understand how to manage your horse expenses to lessen the stress of horsekeeping. This event is sponsored by Care Credit. To answer your questions, we are joined by two expert panelists, Dr. Jorge Colón of Cornell University and Dr. Wendy Krebs of Bend Equine Medical Center. Welcome to both of you.
Thanks for having us.
Haley.
Dr. Colón, can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Sure. Hello, everybody. My name is Jorge Colón, and I'm an equine veterinarian by training who now does business education for veterinary students at Cornell. I'm a Cornell undergrad and Cornell DVM grad, but I spent 25 years of my professional career as an equine ambulatory veterinarian in Lexington, Kentucky, working with Thoroughbred mares and foals. But my second passion for business and finances drove me to pursue a second career in later years, and now I'm busy helping students become better veterinary professionals by understanding the business of veterinary medicine.
Awesome, thank you. And Dr. Krebs, can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I am also a practicing equine veterinarian in Bend, Oregon, at Bend Equine Medical Center. I graduated in 2002 and we have a pretty diverse practice. We do everything from preventive care to emergencies to surgery and hospitalization. I'm also a horse owner and a competitor who both boards horses for other people here on our property and also boards my own horses and involved in competitions. So I kind of see all of these questions from different perspectives.
Awesome. Before we begin answering questions, I want to remind everyone of our Ask the Horse Live format. We're starting with questions submitted during registration. If you're listening live and would like to submit a question, please do so via the chat window. We'll do our best to get to as many of your questions as possible. If you're listening to the podcast recording of this event and would like to join us live in the future, please visit thehorse.com/askthehorselive to register for notifications. And with that, we're going to jump into our questions. Dr. Colón, this first one's for you. It's from Oliver in Australia, who asks if you're able to give a breakdown of normal expenses associated with horse ownership. And also, Brenda in England wants to know what's caused the rise in these expenses.
Well, yeah, this is a challenging question to answer because the answer is usually not a good one to hear. And obviously, when we look at having a horse, there's significant costs associated with the food and nutrition of the animal, boarding expenses, grooming expenses, and then when we're taking care of the horse, we have needs for farrier depending on the animal and any condition that the horse might have, tack and gear associated with the animal depending on what you do with it, routine and emergency veterinary care, which is extremely important. If you're in the situation where you're in the breeding business, then there's breeding costs associated with. If you do anything with breeding or with showing or anything like that, transportation costs, entry fees and stuff like that to different horse shows and different stuff like that. And other treatments that come to play that are more prevalent today than before, chiropractic treatments, acupuncture treatment, things like that. We can't forget about things related to end-of-life care. There's medical diseases that become more prevalent the older the animal is, and then there's expenses associated with end of life as well. And then there's expenses associated with insurance, for example, if you're going to be dealing with managing some of the expenses by mitigating the risk through insurance, and there's costs associated with insurance. So these are not obviously a complete list of things, but these are components of the expenses associated with having a horse. Now, all of the things that I just mentioned have gone up in price over time, severely gone up in price over time, not only for the animal, but for us as well. If you go buy groceries at the grocery store, if you go anything, things are more expensive today. So the extreme rise in costs associated with the fact that just things are more expensive. And so when you're looking at the expense of a horse, one needs to look at all of the things associated with having that horse. And so there's a lot of them involved. Veterinary care is one of them. As a veterinarian, obviously I understand what the cost of veterinary care are, but sometimes they're a very small component of the care of a horse. And so all these things are, a combination of these things are what would answer both of those questions. What are the costs associated with a horse, and why the sudden rise? It's not a sudden rise, it's been going up over time. I've been in practice for almost 30 years, and things are a lot more expensive today than they were when I graduated. But that will be my answer to that.
Awesome, thank you. Dr. Krebs, Brenda also wants to know where, if any, can there be safeguards to the spiraling cost of equine veterinary care?
Mm-hmm. Well, Haley, as Dr. Colón alluded to, I think inflation is a big part of the increased cost of veterinary care. I think another big factor is we have a lot more advanced treatment options than we had, 20 and 30 years ago in terms of advanced imaging, things like MRI and bone scan and PET scan that were really not on anybody's radar in a significant way, years ago, but are now options for us, as well as just more advanced intensive care for neonates or for adult horses, and things like advanced fracture repairs. So the cost of the basic equine healthcare, I think, has not gone up disproportionately a lot more than the cost of inflation. But this is certainly something I talk with my clients a lot about. There are certainly ways that they can, create a budget and do their best to stay within that budget. I think one of the most important things is focusing efforts on really diligent preventive care. Truly, it's a bit of an old saw, but catching problems while they're still small, doing annual dental care, vaccinations, and good hoof care. All of those things are going to help prevent bigger, more expensive problems in the future. Horses are very accident prone, so doing what you can to make their horse's environment as safe as possible, prevent them, use safe fencing so they're not going to get lacerations from barbed wire, set up your facility such that they can't get into the grain or into other horses' enclosures and get kicked, things like that. Keeping your horse's body condition appropriate, because we certainly all know that a fat, overweight horse is prone to laminitis and other problems. I also really advocate for creating a strong relationship with your veterinarian so that they understand you and your needs, and you can have a good conversation when the time comes about guiding you through emergency situations and the decision making that needs to happen in those, making sure it's consistent, with what you are able to afford and what you would want to do for your horse. I think some veterinarians, and there's another question that will allude to this a bit later, but certainly try to do all they can to make dentals and vaccinations available to their clients, sometimes by doing barn days or haul-in situations where they can be more efficient and then pass that savings on to owners. I always advocate for starting a savings account for your horse, and you can call that your HSA, your horse savings account. We don't always think about that, but it's just a really smart idea. And then again, considering insurance policies, credit cards with an available balance, planning ahead for those unexpected needs.
Absolutely. Dr. Colón, Joyce in South Carolina asks if its insurance is worth the cost.
So before I answer that question, I want to echo Dr. Krebs' statements about preventative care and doing everything you can to reduce the incidence of worse things happening. As a veterinarian, my whole practice, and I think Dr. Krebs shares the same philosophy, was to promote preventative care as much as possible, because though it looks like we're trying to do things up front, what we're actually trying to avoid is the things that would happen later, which actually are a lot more expensive. Plus, they usually happen in the middle of the night. And so I'd rather be at the barn with you during the day trying to prevent a disease process than talking to you about how bad things are at 2 in the morning because we didn't prevent the problem in the first place. So I think I share Dr. Krebs' philosophy about that. talking about that, insurance is a very important component to understand, not only on the horse side, but in the life scenario, right? Insurance is nothing but a mitigation of risk by shifting the risk, the financial risk of something, to a second party in exchange for a premium. There's something in insurance called the large loss principle. And what that basically means is that anything that you can afford to lose, you self-insure for it. But anything that you cannot afford to lose, that you need to have, but you don't have the finances to pay for that, then you shift the risk to someone who does have the money, right? If I go buy a computer and they offer me the extended warranty, I probably won't buy the extended warranty because my life situation allows me to, if I lose a computer, I can probably replace it. But my house has a mortgage on it and the bank requires insurance on it, but still, I will not have the finances to replace my house if something happened to it. And so I insure my house. So on the horse scenario, the insurance is worth it depending on the financial value of the horse. Now, I don't want to sound callous, but I'm talking about the financial value, not the emotional value. In fact, an insurance company will not insure an animal for the emotional value, they'll just insure it for its financial value. So depending on how much is the financial value of that horse, that potentially shows you how much you could lose if you were to lose that horse. And so that which you cannot afford, then you should mitigate the risk by insuring it. So most people should probably be able to handle normal everyday expenses, even emergency expenses associated with, a laceration repair that, they can get expensive, but you should be able to handle that. But if all of a sudden you're thrown in a severe large colon volvulus that requires surgery and resection of the GI and 15 days in the hospital, and you have, a $8, $10, $15,000 bill or whatever that might be. I'm not trying to put a price on anything, but if you have a large number like that, then most people probably are not in a situation to handle that. So that's where insurance comes to play, and you could insure the animal for that reason. So there's also different types of insurance that the person that is Joyce should be thinking about when they're thinking about insurance. It's not just insurance, it's what type of insurance. Most people will probably have something related to mortality or theft insurance. And to my best knowledge, don't quote me on this, but somewhere around 3.5% of the insured value will be the cost of the premium for that, something like that. I'm not an insurance agent. But there's another type of insurance that you can add on to that, which is major medical and surgical, right? If you want to be able to have that colic covered, for example, that colic surgery, there might be a component of insurance that you can add on. What is the cost of that? I'm not sure. I'm not trying to sell insurance here, but if somebody told me, my premium is $200 to $500 a year, I would not be surprised. But that will probably come with some type of deductible, and then you will probably have a copay associated with that as well. So again, I would exhort anybody interested in insurance to explore the different options available to try to find out what the true cost based on the value and the use of the animal is. Does it cover colic surgery? Does it not cover colic surgery? Another insurance for those of you who have horses in public places, like your border at a farm, for example. There's a private horse owner liability insurance. What happens if your horse by accident causes through an accident causes damage to somebody else's person or property? Then the owner of the horse that created that accident is liable for the injuries suffered by that other person or that other equipment or property. And so liability insurance for those reasons is another one that someone could have. And then the other thing, and insurance world is, I'm a consumer of insurance myself. Pre-existing conditions come into play. I believe in the small animal world, something happened here recently where some people lost their small animal pet insurance, and the conditions that those animals had, now they cannot be accepted into the insurance because now they're considered pre-existing conditions. So I would always explore issues associated with pre-existing conditions in times of renewal. If you ever have had to use your insurance make sure that they don't use whatever you needed to use it for against you in the future. But in a basic scenario, insurance is just shifting the risk of that financial loss that you are not able to sustain. And so is it worth it? It depends on your personal situation and the value of your horse.
Dr. Krebs, Mary Lou in Wisconsin wants to know if operating costs change when a larger company buys a smaller veterinary practice.
That's an interesting question. We are really just in the last few years starting to see a little more consolidation of equine practices, as well as the entrance of more corporate practice into equine practice, which historically has been more of a private solo practitioner scenario. I think the answer is that it really depends on the individual situation that we're talking about there. In some cases, practice consolidation can actually help with lowering prices to some extent, because those larger practices are able to, garner better deals on their supplies and potentially pass that on to their clients as well. We do see in small animal practice that in some cases with corporate practice, there's a bit more of a focus on profitability for the practice that does end up increasing pricing for clients ultimately. So it's a bit hard to say, and it will be interesting to see how that plays out over the next few years in the equine veterinary industry. Dr. Colón, did you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I agree, Dr. Press, with what you said. It really depends on the entity. I want our listeners to understand that operating expenses of running a veterinary practice are a fairly large component of the expenses that veterinarians go through. And when a larger practice buys a smaller practice, as you very correctly mentioned, there's instances not only in the purchasing power of supplies that we use, but instead of having two separate CPAs, now we only need one. There's reduction in expenses, the operational efficiency increases. There's better computer systems and HR management. There's a lot of things that potentially make the clinic a more operationally efficient practice that should translate into better service provision to the consumer that could come with a reduced price associated with, just because they're more efficient. No question about it. As you also correctly mentioned, it depends on who the money is behind the buying of the small practice. If it's corporate coming from venture capital investment, then those people have nothing to do with veterinary medicine. They have just found in veterinary medicine a very recession-proof industry that is very good at maintaining operations even in economic downturns. In fact, most veterinarians saw more work during the pandemic than they did before the pandemic, just because of the attachment of people. This is definitely true on the small animal side. But when that money that's being put into the system of ownership of equine facilities is coming from people who are just making an investment so that they can get their money and more of it back, then that's when actually it's negative, not only for the consumer, the horse owner, but it's actually a not good scenario for the practicing veterinarian either. So it really depends as to who is behind that larger practice consuming the smaller practice.
Yeah, appreciate that input.
Dr. Colón, Nicolette in Colorado wants to know what emergency funds horse owners should have to prepare for unexpected expenses.
Well, Nicolette, I don't feel comfortable trying to literally come up with some random number to tell you. But what I would do is I would start thinking out loud about what are potential emergency funds that I would need for unexpected expenses. A really bad lacerations, that would take 4 hours to suture, a colic surgery that ends up 7 days in the hospital, a fractured leg that requires internal fixation and stall bound for 90 days. I mean, I'm thinking about things like these that could happen to any horse in any day, because I believe Dr. Krebs said, I completely agree there, accident prone. What are the potential expenses associated with that in the area of the country where you live? You're in Colorado, depends where in Colorado you live and what are the facilities that you have nearby. What is the finances of your horse? And then by analyzing what those potential expenses would be is how I would try to figure out what are those emergency funds. No one ever complain about having too much money in their emergency fund, because if you have too much money in your emergency fund, then you just have saved money that you can use for something else at some point in time. The issue is that we never have enough emergency funds. So I would ask you or suggest to you that you look at your personal situation. What type of hit could you absorb associated with a financial unexpected expense associated with some type of accident? And then that will be the number that I'll be shooting for. I mean, if we can assume that a colic surgery could be anywhere between, I don't know, Dr. Krebs, maybe you can help me out a little bit, but anywhere, a simple one could be, you know, $3 grand, and a difficult one could be 15 grand. I mean, and anything in between goes.
Sometimes higher if they're really sick.
Yeah. So these are the things that would dictate to you how much you should have saved. Now, if you're in a scenario, you could be that if a horse required a $15,000 of colic surgery and aftercare, because it's not the surgery, it's the aftercare. I mean, it's both, but the aftercare is the one that adds up real quickly, because as Dr. Krebs well mentioned, the advancements in medicine are so insane in a good way that your horse is getting as much, if not better care than you would be as a human in the hospital. Those risks that you cannot financially cover yourself, that's where insurance comes into play. And so insurance will be your side piece to the emergency fund.
Dr. Krebs, Teresa in California asks if you can offer any guidance for boarding barn owners. How should they adjust their fees based on the increasing cost of care?
Yeah, so as I mentioned in the introduction, I actually am in this position too as a boarding barn owner in a small way, and also board my horses out, and a couple of them, and cringe when I get those bills each month. I think it's becoming increasingly difficult for boarding barn owners to not operate at a loss. I think that the availability of labor has really shifted in the last few years, and it's much harder to find available and, shall we say, affordable labor to do the great amount of work that is associated with maintaining a facility and providing good care to horses. As well, the costs of land, building, insurance, and feed, all of that has gone up quite steeply in the last few years. So I think, unfortunately, the truth of it is that boarding barn owners can't just absorb that extra cost, even though we would all like to, and we hate to increase our fees to our boarders, but we just have to proportionately increase our fees such that we can continue to operate, or we won't be able to do that, and that's the reality of it.
Yeah, and I would add to that, if you are a horse owner, as painful as it is for bills to go up, as Dr. Krebs mentioned, because costs go up, I would be very wary if I was a horse owner, and the reason why my bills are not going up, which I'm feeling ecstatic about, is because if I really look down, there's corners being cut every which way I look. Because that's not a place where you want to have your horse. Because nothing but bad things are brewing in this kitchen here. Something bad is going to happen when people cut corners. So as much as it might sound awesome that your costs for boarding your horse have not gone up, the only way that it happens is somebody cutting corners. Are they buying the hay that nobody else wanted, and that's why they got it so cheap? Because somebody had to get rid of it, and that's what they're feeding your horse? That would be a terrible scenario for you as a horse owner, right? So I would just think about the reasons why and just understand socioeconomic factors of reality of life. If prices are not going up, then there's a problem somewhere that might be a worse problem.
Yeah. Yeah, and conscientious boarding barn owners, you absolutely, need to pass those increased costs on to your clients. It's not your responsibility to personally bear those increases and subsidize those costs for your boarders.
Dr. Colón, Jill from our live audience is curious whether the doctors believe that the average horse owner has fewer expenses if they board a horse versus when they keep it at home, given similar amenities in both situations. And you can both weigh in on this, please.
Well, this is going to be a gut feeling answer here. I don't have any data to back this up, but I would have to assume that outside of one specific cost, all the other upkeep costs for the animal are going to be almost identical or very similar. The one expense that will be lower would be, well, you don't have the boarding expense associated with the fee paid, separate the food and the water and the whatever. But if you have it at home, then you have the fee associated with you at some point, somehow, some way purchase the land or have the land or have a mortgage on the land or a lease in the land where you have the animal. And now, as Dr. Press really well mentioned, somebody has to keep the daily labor of this animal. By the way, they're accident prone 24/7. So the labor costs associated with having this animal, now they're on you. So you're not paying for it in the boarding side, but it's on you to supply it. And yes, everybody says, I'll feed my horse and I will clean the stall, but I don't know what the normal amount of time it is, because somebody realizes that, hey, I can't do it because, or I just missed another event that I couldn't go to because, et cetera, then there are costs associated with when you have it at home that you won't have if they are at the boarding farm, but the boarding farm replaces that cost by the fact that they're charging you board. So one way or the other, I think that it washes out. You have the opportunity to not have to worry about some things when the horse is at a boarding farm, but then you have to worry about the horse when it's at your place. What do you think, Dr. Press?
I think it really depends a lot on how much of the labor you intend to do yourself boarding your horse at home. If you are paying someone to come onto your private property and care for that horse, obviously that gets expensive in a hurry. Whereas if you are willing to do, the hours of work each day required yourself, then you can certainly save money on that. I think it's also fair to recognize that boarding facility owners probably need to make a little bit of profit doing this. Otherwise, there's really very little reason, other than the goodness of their hearts to do it. So, and they deserve that. So doing that yourself, obviously, you don't have to account for that. But as Dr. Colón mentioned, it is a huge commitment to care for your own horses 24/7 and really limits your lifestyle. And, you cannot just leave at the drop of the hat. You have to hire people to come stay at the facility and at your home and take care of the horses. So it's a very individual decision. It could go either way.
Dr. Colón, Mary in Virginia asks how record keeping can help her manage horse-related expenses.
Well, Mary, you talk on one of my favorite topics that my students hate, and that's the topic of budgeting. And budgeting is basically you writing stuff down so you can keep track of stuff so that even if you want to appear surprised, your handwriting tells you that you shouldn't be, because now you actually know. See, when you write down the expenses that you have, They will always look higher than what you thought that they were going to be. I was reading some study that said that expenses in horse ownership are usually somewhere between 3 and 4 times higher than what the individual expected them to be. And the reason for that is they have not kept, they think they know how much they spent in feed last year, or they think they know how much they spent on something else last year. But had they kept track of it, they would actually be able to know exactly how much it is, and then they would have a really, really good idea of how much that emergency fund that we were talking about in the previous, one of the previous questions needs to be. If we kept better track, not only about our cost of our horse, but our cost of life in general, as to what we do and how much it costs us to do what we're doing, and we kept better track of it, there wouldn't be any surprises as to the planning process to be ready for that potential issue. I guarantee you that every single person in this call tonight, if I were to ask you, how much do you think you spend dining out in a year? All of you will give yourself an answer that will more likely than not be severely underestimating how much you actually spend. Just because it's human nature not to want to see things in the worst possible way, which usually the reality could be the worst possible way. And so when you keep track of those expenses through proper record keeping, then being able to manage those expenses is going to be so much, it will be less surprising, it will be better management, you'll be better prepared, there'll be no surprises, and you will be well prepared to attack and address that financial compromise associated with an emergency, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Colón, Aubrey in Georgia asked what the estimated cost to own one horse in 1 year would be.
Again, I actually did a little research on this, and I have some general ballpark numbers, but I didn't want to throw any specific number because I don't want someone quoting me that Colón said that it costs this much. But it depends. I don't like that Dr. Krebs and I have to keep using this word, but it really depends. Where do you live? What type of horse do you have? What do you do with that horse? Does it have conditions, right? My father-in-law dropped off a little pony for our daughter at home, and I never got asked. I was just gonna take care of it, and the first thing I did was run up PPID on the horse, and of course, my horse was on PPID medication for the rest of his life, right? There's cost associated with, so it depends what you use the animal for. In a study that I was looking at, and again, this just happened to be, is a study that was supported by Care Credit, who's our sponsor tonight. But on average, they found that the average horse has around a 25-year lifetime. And, you know, in my practice, I had horses that never made it to 25, and I had a bunch of horses that were in the, you know, they got to 30. So there's a little bit of everything. But it depends. This study said that they had 3 general areas. One area was competition level horses, one area was recreation level horses, and one area was around backyard horses. And over a lifespan of around 25 years, they were coming around that a backyard horse was costing somewhere around $10,000 a year for a total anywhere between $215,000 and $290,000 during the lifetime of that horse. A recreation horse was a little more costly at somewhere around 14 grand. And in their study, and I don't know what type of competition horses they were doing, because if this is a thoroughbred horse on track for the Kentucky Derby, it will be way higher than this. But, you know, someone in competition could be spending $30,000 a year in care for their horse. So it depends what the animal is. It will be extremely surprising to me if somebody wouldn't be taking proper care of their animal, and after they put all their horse-related expenses, even for a backyard horse, that they're not running into somewhere between $8,000 and $10,000 a year. It will be surprising to me if that's not what's happening. So it depends what you do with your horse.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think it can vary by orders of magnitude, depending on the level of care we're talking about. If you have a horse that lives out on the range, you know, versus a high-level show horse, that's a very different story there. But I think you're in the right ballpark with your kind of moderate range there of up to 10,000.
Yeah, it depends. If you know, out west, if you can be in the range and the animal can feed itself, and you know and you eliminate feed cost, and that's a huge component of, right? So it really depends. It really depends.
Dr. Krebs, Jennifer in New York wants to know if buying hay in bulk for 1 year will save her money, and if it will the hay keep its nutritional value for that time?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think in most cases it is more affordable to buy your hay in advance for the year directly from the grower, rather than what some of my clients do, which is buying it, monthly from the feed store. If you are buying it direct from the grower, then you're sort of cutting out the middleman and the need for the feed store to mark up that hay and to store it. Hay that is stored in a dry and not dusty situation does store very well and will actually keep all of its calorie content. It will keep all of its sugar content, for better or worse, and it will keep all of its mineral content. The vitamins do start to degrade within the first few weeks, particularly vitamin E. And so that is something to keep in mind. But in most parts of the country, where the producers are really only harvesting hay during the summer months, so any hay that you're buying throughout the winter and early spring will have been stored regardless in most cases. So I think it's a good opportunity to point out that horses that don't have access to either fresh hay or fresh grass, you need to think about their vitamin E consumption and whether they should be supplemented during the winter. Most horses probably should. But yeah, if you can buy it all at once and store it in a good manner, then that's a good plan, and also avoids, shortages and sort of desperate buying of poor quality hay, at the end of the year before the first cutting happens.
Yeah, and if I can add to that, as Dr. Krebs said, storing it properly. Again, I think I mentioned earlier about my lack of patience for cutting corners. Storing hay improperly is not a cost-saving method, because that's going to lead to bad results later. So storing it properly is essential. And as Dr. Krebs mentioned, if you can reduce the costs associated with that product getting to your hands, specifically the fact that it doesn't have to go through someone else who has to pay for their own bills before they have to charge you for it, then it will definitely save you money in the long run, as long as you can store it properly.
Yeah, there is going to be some upfront costs. That's a good point in creating a good storage situation. And that doesn't mean putting it at the end of your arena where it's going to get, absolutely coated in dust by the time you feed it months later. It means, a good separate storage area and tarping it and being responsible about it.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. This is a multi-year process. If you build a good storage area on year one, that hay was a lot more expensive than if you had bought it from the feed store. But if you keep that place properly over time, then your cost of feed annually, your average annual cost of feed will be much lower by you taking care of the storage. Now you have to go through the expense of creating that good storage area in the first place.
Mm-hmm. An alternative too, we grow hay here on our ranch too. If you form a good relationship with a hay grower that has the ability to store it for you, but they know you're a reliable buyer, and they might be willing to do that for you as well. So explore those options and relationships.
Dr. Colón, Shelby in Florida wants to know how horse owners should financially prepare for natural disasters such as hurricanes.
This is very specific, and by the way, this is a very timely question. I think the financial planning is no different. The hurricane component of this question is just a level of risk associated with the fact this person lives in Florida. So their potential exposure to risk associated with hurricanes is higher than mine in upstate New York. So while I still have to prepare financially for any accidents that my horse could get into, someone who could be in the path of a hurricane has more accidents in the menu to be influenced by. And so understanding that the exposure to those risks is higher than the finances of preparing for those risks needs to be accordingly higher. But one of the other things that you can do is to prepare, and not necessarily on the financial side, that this could lead to financial differences, is planning ahead properly, right? A properly identified through a microchip, for example, horse, should be able to find its owner's back if it were ever to get lost in a natural disaster scenario faster. That could potentially lead to a reduction in their risk of running around or being stolen or something like that. So proper identification of an animal, where are you placing this animal when there's a hurricane coming, can also change the financial result. I don't have the proper recipe, right? But if you lock up a horse in a stable so that it just cannot get hit by the stuff outside, then, you know, it's a stable prone to getting flooded, because then the animal cannot get out. So it's a varied thing, right? Do you leave him in the field somewhere and then just let him fend for itself like nature intended in the first place, and then try to find him? Like, I don't know what the proper answer is, but proper preparation is essential. Just understanding the risks that that animal could get exposed to during a hurricane. Flying debris is a major accident and death creator in hurricane scenarios. Is your horse exposed to that type of environment based on where you leave that horse when the hurricane's coming? Because if that's the case, then the financial scenario could be negatively impacted towards you if the worst case scenario were to happen. So all these, planning ahead is the answer to this question, and understanding that the risk of injury and accident related to hurricanes is obviously greater in areas where you live, because this is where the hurricanes go by. I mean, I'm from Puerto Rico, so it's the same thing originally for us, right? So it just depends where you are and the risk that you're exposed to.
Dr. Krebs, Katie in Australia asked if you can talk a little bit about euthanasia due to financial constraints. Are there situations where this might be the best option?
Yeah, that's a hard topic. And I don't know if Katie means specifically in regards to situations where the horse is going to require medical care that is not potentially affordable, or if we were talking more about euthanasia because they can't afford the routine costs of horse ownership. Obviously, if it's for routine costs, I feel like there are typically better options in terms of reaching out to rescues, things like that. Although there are times when it is the responsible thing to do to make that hard choice for your aged horse that otherwise doesn't have good options, you know, for ongoing care. Certainly, I deal a lot with the situations where we have terrible colics or injuries to horses that are not affordable for the owner, that they don't have the resources, you know, to pursue that care for the horses. And sometimes, you know, it's not in the horse's best interest, frankly, to go through extended medical treatment for really severe things that don't have a great prognosis. So it's a you know, conversation that we have with that individual owner and horse. If it's a healthy horse that we feel like it has a good chance at quality of life afterwards, we always try to work with those owners to find a responsible alternative outcome. We as a practice have some angel funds that we use to help support care in those situations, and or rescues that sometimes are willing to help out too. But there's a lot of nuance there, and so those can be really wrenching but important conversations to have.
And on that topic, Dr. Krebs, Jake in Colorado wants to know what the costs associated with euthanasia are.
That's a great question, and it can be variable. If we are talking about a planned euthanasia, for example, for a horse that has a chronic medical condition that we don't feel its quality of life is good, we can make that fairly affordable in most cases. It can be just a few $100s, depending on what your area is, and to speak frankly, what the disposal options are for the body of the horse afterwards. There are parts of the country where disposal is becoming quite a challenge and therefore expensive. There are also owners that want to, rather than the kind of most practical options of having a horse interred at a landfill, might want to do cremation, which can run to several thousands of dollars. So for a non-emergency one, I would say a few $100s. For an emergency situation, middle of the night, looking at emergency fees as well as expensive disposal, it can be a couple thousand. So again, a good opportunity for you to plan ahead and try to control those circumstances as much as you can.
Dr. Colón, Rebecca in Arizona wants to purchase a horse farm soon. Do you have any tips for her as a new farm owner in respect to finances?
Aside from the things that we have covered already, right? Understanding the costs of keeping a horse. When we're talking about now the cost of keeping the farm, I think that people, human nature, to underestimate all of the costs associated with keeping the place. Insurance is a word that's used widely, but do you have the proper insurance? Feed, are you just buying the feed that you can afford, or are you buying the feed that is actually required and you have to find the money from somewhere else because the feed that you should be feeding is greater than what you planned for, right? There's going to be a lot of costs associated with the caring of the land. Rotating because you're leaving a little bit of grass there, but yeah, that grass will grow better later. So just proper management, and do you have the space that you need to have? Are you buying a farm and before you finish putting the last post of the fence, is it already too small for the needs that you actually had? All these things come into play and trying to figure out the finances of that farm. Understand that emergencies will happen. That beautiful fence that costs you a lot of money to put up will be destroyed in a nanosecond when some horse decides to run through it, because that's what they like to do. And so now you have to go replace that backup. So I would not, like anything else in life, if all you have in your pocket is $10, I wouldn't buy something that costs $10. You need to have something left over for that next thing that's going to need some financial backup. And so understanding all of the costs, the easiest to see ones and the I didn't know about that cost ones. That's where your association with CPAs, with bankers, with loan officers, with, do you have the proper permits from your county where you live in? All these things come into play, and all these somehow, some way have a financial cost to them. And so I would want to make sure that I find out everything that I can before I make a decision.
And as a follow-up to that, Dr. Colón, Jennifer in New Jersey asks, for farm owners who keep their horses at home, what type of farm maintenance and equipment expenses should they expect? Are there loans or programs that people can take advantage of to help with that?
So on the maintenance and equipment, again, the word depends. It depends on, like, I don't know what type of tractor do you have. Do you have, I don't know. Do you have a tractor that, its tires are $1,200 a piece? I don't know that. But you should know, Jennifer, if you know what that type of equipment is, then what is the normal service care of that? Like, what is the average cost, just like your routine care for your animal? What is the average routine care for that tractor? To change the oil, to anything with the batteries? I'm not a mechanic, so I would just talk to the mechanic for that equipment. And all the other things that you use in the property. In terms of loan programs, if I'm understanding the question correctly, if this is a self-owned personal farm, I am not aware of any personal use loans other than normal financing for the property for purchase or something like that. If you finance the equipment as an individual, but I'm not aware of any public loan programs to help a individual with their own equipment at their farm. Maybe I'm mistaken, but I'm not aware of one.
Dr. Krebs, Robert in Massachusetts wants to know if the cost of owning a horse increases as they age.
That is a great question. And I think in general, it does tend to increase a bit, and for multiple reasons. Older horses obviously tend to have more disease processes, health conditions going on. I think many of us, like Dr. Colón mentioned, own horses that have Cushing's, for example. And that is not an inexpensive disease in terms of the medication and the ongoing testing and management that's needed. So that's a big one that stands out in my mind. Certainly, if they haven't had good dental care through the first part of their lives, they may require frequent care at this point, 2 or 3 times a year, as well as potentially needing to eat pelleted senior feed rather than, more affordable hay or pasture. So I would say generally you can expect increased costs as they age, for sure.
Dr. Krebs and Dr. Colón, you could also weigh in on this one. Diane in Tennessee wants to know what horse owners can do to set their horses up financially should the owner pass away.
Yeah, that's a good one. And I do have a few clients that have actually set up situations, legal situations for their horses for that circumstance. Some of those have been as involved as getting an attorney to actually set up a trust for their horses and their other animals, and then designating people that will be responsible for them. So they have had to decide whether that's going to actually include financial support, which is probably a good idea because horses can live for a long time and be pretty expensive. Or in less formal situations, if it's just a commitment from a good friend, that they're willing to be the custodian for the horse. And reaching out to your veterinarian kind of to talk to them about it is not a bad idea. I have had that conversation with a few clients and also volunteered to not directly take responsibility, but to sort of help chaperone that transition with the horse and be in the background. So Dr. Colón, I don't know if you have any experience.
Yeah, no, I mean, everything you said, I wholeheartedly agree with it. Looking at the letter of the specific words that I think I just heard, setting up a horse financially if the owner were to pass away, I'm going to assume that there was an owner who had the financial means and now they're no longer around. And as Dr. Krebs said, the utilization of legal advice would be the proper way to go, because how the instruments utilized, and again, I'm not a lawyer, depending on what state you're in, the instruments that you utilize to direct what happens to those things that are yours when they're no longer yours because you're no longer around they can either be managed by the state, not in a way that you would have wanted, or they can be managed by the way that you wanted to because you left the instructions. And so how those instructions are left behind, the best way to do that would be to get proper legal advice. And it could be as much as Dr. Krebs said, you have some friend that can take care of that animal, but you want to leave them your money so they can have money to take care of the animal. You're not just, this is gonna sound bad, but dumping your horse on them because you passed away, but you're dumping your horse and your money on them, and that way they can take care of your horse for you while you're no longer around. So the legal passing of finances to somebody else after you pass is a legal matter that for it to be done properly, and you won't be able to have your opinion because the reason why it's passing is because you pass away, is by leaving a proper documentation properly done.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Colón, this will likely be our last question of the night. It's from Rebecca in Texas, who says that her horse has PPID and osteoarthritis, which both require daily prescription medications. Are there any programs that offer discounted prescriptions for horses or could help her afford this major expense?
Well, Rebecca, I can share with you that you just described my horse when I had it, and I think we also described Dr. Krebs' horse.
Yes.
PPID, as Dr. Krebs mentioned, properly managed is a lifelong commitment to maintain and slow down the progress of a disease that can lead to humane euthanasia when the quality of life is not adequate. It's not only the medication for the PPID, but it's the more routine farrier. Like, you don't want to call a farrier for that PPID horse when that horse starts looking ouchy. At that point in time, you're too late, more likely than not. And it's going to be pretty expensive to figure out if you are too late or not. So those are ongoing costs, not just for the medication, but for the care, farrier, and veterinary, and diet, and all those other things. Same thing with osteoarthritis, right? It just gets worse over time. You're trying to slow the progress. In terms of the cost of medications, there is, outside of the fact that different pharmaceutical companies offer coupons and discounts and different things throughout the year, I am not aware of any programs that offer discounted prescriptions for horses. What I do want to make sure is that people do find cheaper medications in the web world that are not proper medications for the animal. And while I'm not here to speak for the pharmaceutical company, I'm here to speak on behalf of veterinarians who require that animals get properly treated with and for the condition that they have, with the medications that can do the job at treating that condition. Happy to hear what Dr. Krebs have to say about that, but if you're finding a very cheap off-brand, off-label, non-FDA approved drug that claims to do the exact same thing as your PPID medication, more likely than not, it's not doing anything for your horse. So it's actually the most expensive medication that you can be buying. So
Yeah, I absolutely agree.
yeah, I mean, the most expensive medication that you can have is the cheap one that doesn't do what it's supposed to do.
Yeah, exactly. If it's too good to be true, it's really too good to be true. Go ahead.
That's all the time we have for tonight. We've covered a lot, and I hope our listeners have learned as much as I have. Thank you, Drs. Colón and Krebs, for joining me.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you very much for this. I really appreciate the invitation.
Thank you to Care Credit for sponsoring this event, and thank you to our audience for listening and sending in these questions. If you're listening to us after the live event as a podcast episode, please rate, review, subscribe, and recommend Ask the Horse Live to a friend. Until next time, from everyone at the Horse, have a great night.